I thought after the chaos of the live stream, you might value a more sort of controlled and sensible explanation of how to make a Dorset button, because our video on Sunday is going to focus on this sort of process and some similar processes. So I just wanted to show it you all in one go so that it all made sense. So I've got my length of thread here and I have knotted it to my needle. I've got my length of thread, I've got about 3 meters here, and I'm just going to start by taking my thread through the ring like that. And I want to create a little loop like this, and I'm going to take my needle through that loop and pull the thread all the way through, and it will gather up a little bit, but if I just go steady it will all come right. So that effectively is my first blanket stitch. Now I could work my way around and catch in the end as I come back round, but actually what I've discovered is if I turn my ring over, my blanket stitch is then going in the right direction. So I'm just going to keep hold of the end of my thread, and this takes a little bit of dexterity, and I'm going to keep the working thread taut by holding it between 2 fingers there, and from this point I can just blanket stitch. So I'm going through the loop, making sure that I've caught my thread over my needle like that and pull through the loop, and I'm just going to gradually pull that thread all the way through and then tighten up my blanket stitch. And then I'm going to repeat that process, and when I've got quite a few on there I can let go of the end and it will just stay in place and I have fewer things to worry about then. So starting off is a little bit of a trick, and you are helped by staying calm and just working methodically, just like I didn't do in our live stream. Just going to pull that end tight just so that that first stitch is nice and tight, and then I can just let go now because it will stay in place. So I'm just going to keep going with those blanket stitches. I have got a little bit of a noose knot there, but I'm not going to worry about it for the time being because it'll all come right. So I've got about 1 centimetre of blanket stitches there. I'm actually going to trim off that tail a little bit just to make it more manageable. We just want to keep our blanket stitches as close together as we can. So I'm going to stitch in the rest of the blanket stitches and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. Now I have got all the way around and I've made sure that I've pushed my blanket stitches together as much as possible so that the whole ring is covered. I reckon I can get probably 2 more in there, so I'm just easing those blanket stitches around, holding them back with my nail, and then I'm just letting my new stitch sit in that gap just to make sure that there's no uncovered parts of the ring. So there we go. I've been practicing my scalloped edges as well, so I've discovered a slightly easier way of doing it that's going to make sure our scallops are nice and even. So normally we would then turn that ridge to the back of the ring, but I'm actually going to leave it on the outside for this one. What I'm going to do is, before I start putting my spokes in, I'm just going to take my needle through that first blanket stitch, just to make sure that I've closed up the hole, and that's just going to stabilise a little bit. Now I'm going to lay my spokes, and my first one is going to go across the centre like that, and I'm going to come back up to meet it, and then I'm going to rotate my ring and just lay my next spoke as I go around. I want to keep these fairly evenly spaced, but I want to make sure that I'm going across the centre each time. So this is really worth taking some time to get right, and I'm creating a sort of star. I can always adjust the positioning of those spokes later. I'm now holding that taut, so I'm using all the fingers of my hand. I've got that thread caught around my finger there just to keep it tight, and it's coming down on the back there. And so what I want to do is go directly across and bring my needle up in between the spokes that are directly across. From the last one that I laid. Just want to keep that in place. And now I'm going to come across again, and I just want to put some stitches in the centre there that are going to hold my spokes together and are going to even out any gaps. So I can see that that one has moved around a little bit, and where it was all crisscrossed before, you can see that as I'm putting these stitches across the centre, they are evening back out. So I'm just easing those spokes around by hooking my needle under the front and just shuffling the spoke around ever so slightly so that they are nice and even. And I'm just going to look for places where the back and front of the spoke are not lined up. Got a little clump there. Again, it's a tangle and not a knot, so I'm not too worried about it. Could do with one there. I think that's pretty much there. So now we're going to do our spider's web weaving. So I'm just looking for where my thread has come down, and it's come down in the middle here. So I've essentially gone over this spoke here. So I'm going to come forward 2 spokes and pull my thread through. And then I'm going to go back down over 1. And forward under 2. Back over 1. So if you haven't seen our October stitch guide, this is essentially a spider's web wheel, and I go through that process much more clearly and slowly in that video. So if you haven't seen it, do go and check that out, because once you've got the method for a spider's web wheel, this process actually becomes very easy. So any places where your spokes aren't sitting quite right will correct itself as you do this woven bit. So every now and again you can just use your nail to push down on your wraps so that they move towards the centre, and that will just give you a really nice finish. So that's me all the way around, and I'm just going to keep repeating that process until I've reached the edge. So I will come back when I've filled in all those wraps, and then we'll look at the next stage, how to put our scalloped edges on. Okay, so I've worked my way all the way around, and I've got a little bit of space just on the inside of the ring there. I quite like that, so I'm just going to leave it there. Could keep going and fill in that space completely, and because I've got so many spokes that would actually work fairly well, but I quite like that little gap. I just think it looks really nice. So I promised I would show you a slightly easy way to do scallops around the edge. So I've got my thread coming up at the back, and I'm just going to use, if you remember, we didn't turn our ridge around to the back like we normally do. I'm going to use my spokes as a guide to my scallops. I've switched to a sharp needle now, and I'm just going to bring my thread through the ridge just where my first spoke is. And I'm pulling it all the way through, and I'm going to create a bar. So I'm going to find my next spoke, and I'm going to take my needle through again there. And I've had quite a few questions on Instagram about how I keep my bars even, and I use my thumbnail. So I'm just going to tuck my thumbnail in and pull until that thread sits against my thumbnail. So I've got my thumbnail against the edge of the button, and I'm just pulling until the bar sits on my thumbnail. And then I also find that if I do a double bar, it twists less. So I'm just going to go back across and bring my needle through again. So I'm back to the left hand side of that bar, and again I'm just going to get my thumbnail in and pull until that second bar sits on the first. You can also just get your needle in and just pull until they are even, and then we're just going to blanket stitch through that bar. So I'm going through the bar and making sure my working thread is behind my needle. That's my first blanket stitch. I want to pull that so it's nice and tight against the beginning of that scallop there. And there's my second. So I'm counting these as I go because I want the same number of stitches on each bar. That's going to keep them nice and even. So that's 2 blanket stitches, 3, 4, 5. I reckon I'm going to get 8 on here. 6, That's 7, and here's my 8th. There we go. So there's my scallop, and I don't want that to twist, so what I'm going to do is bring my needle back through to the front at the right hand side of that scallop, and that sort of anchors it in place like that. So I'll just show you that again. So I'm at the front of the left hand side, I'm working the space between these 2 spokes here. So I'm going to find my second spoke, find the right hand spoke rather, and take my needle through to the back. I'm going to get my thumbnail in so that I control the size of that loop, like that. And then I'm going to come back the other way, so that I'm always starting on the left hand side of my loop. Pull it through, just make sure I've got the same amount of thread on both bars. There we go. And then I know that I need to count 8 blanket stitches onto here now. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8, and then I'm going to come back through to the front. There we go. So I'm going to put the rest of those scallops in, and then we'll come back and look at the finished button. Okay, so that is my last scallop, and I'm just going to bring my thread through to the front again, just like I did before, and that just makes sure that last scallop sits in the same way as all the others. Just easing that thread down in between those 2 scallops. So now I've got my remaining thread. I didn't have a huge amount left out of that great long length that I started with, and so what I'm going to do is just tuck my needle underneath the blanket stitches and just working back on myself, just slide under a few of them and then ease it out. I've just caught one of the scallops there, so I don't want to do that, so just make sure your needle is free when it emerges, and you might want a thimble for this. It's nice and tight, which is exactly what we want. So I'm just easing that out. It's quite a chunky needle this, you might be better with a straw needle, but this is just what I had to hand. So I'm just pulling that thread through, and then as close as I can get it to the surface of my button, I'm just going to snip it off. And so there's my finished Dorset button with a scalloped edge. Now we're going to use this technique in our video on Sunday, so I hope that has clarified anything from the live stream session that we did, and that's given you a clearer picture of how to make just the simple Dorset button, just the round, and how to add on some scalloped edging that matches your spokes. So have a go, have a practice, and I will see you in Sunday's video when we're going to play around with some more variations on this and some other buttons, trims and edges that you can use in your stitched work. Happy crafting, folks, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.